So everybody, there it is. The preliminary report about the Air India Boeing 787 crash that happened a month ago in Ahmedabad in India. We now have detailed documentation about this incident, about the crash, and about what went wrong in the flight deck. And what is of course very staggering to the whole world is how this report differentiates from all the theories that people have put out on the internet. How we went deep into the system, whereas it turns out the crash might have been caused by much simpler things. Today I want to have a close look at what this document is telling us. Let's have a detailed timeline now. Number 1. The doomed Boeing 787's last flight. Now it is the 12th of June and the Air India 787 of the registration Victor Tango Alpha November Bravo is arriving into Ahmedabad Airport at 11:17 local time. It's arriving from a flight in Delhi and the plane is parked at Bay 34. Now, something that the crew of this flight points out in the pilot defect report, which is a form that's filled out in case any ECAM messages pop up, which is similar to a car's check engine light. In this tech log, the crew mentioned the stab position transducer alert being messaged. The plane for an hour was worked on by a Air India on-duty technician who gave a green light on the aircraft within 1 hour at the ground of Ahmedabad. Now this message would have been related to the horizontal stabilizer of the airplane, and it's highly unlikely to do anything with the dual engine out that the plane later on faced. Number 2. The doomed Air India Flight 171. Now for the following doomed long-haul flight from Ahmedabad to London, the crew was adequately rested and arrived at the airport where they underwent a pre-flight breathalyzer test at 11:55 where they were all found fit to operate the flight. At 12:35 local time, the crew is seen arriving at the gate where they would start boarding. There were 230 passengers on board, 15 passengers were in business class, and 250 passengers were in economy class. The plane ended up being relatively heavy, it was 213 tons heavy, which is within the limit though, because the maximum takeoff weight of the 787 is 218 tons. But it explains why the airplane took a lot of the 3.5-kilometer long runway of Ahmedabad. It also explains the relatively high V speeds of 153 knots at V1, 155 at V rotate, and V2 being 162 knots. At 1:18 p.m. local time, the airplane pushed back from the Bay 34 and it got taxi clearance at 1:25. The plane taxied over to runway 23 via taxiway Romeo 4, where it then backtracked and lined up. At 1:37 local time, the airplane got takeoff clearance and it started rolling 4 seconds after. At 1:38 p.m. and 33 seconds, the airplane achieved V1 and rotate speed was achieved just 2 seconds after that, although the airplane took off only 4 seconds after that as well. The aircraft then achieved its maximum recorded airspeed of 118 knots at around 38:42. And immediately then, something interesting happened. According to the preliminary report, the engine number 1 and 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff, one after another with a time gap of 1 second. Now what that obviously means is that the engines roll back, lose power, because the fuel supply to the engine is cut off. Now the fuel cutoff switch that we're talking about is this one, the Honeywell 4TL837-3D, which as you may know is not a switch that you can accidentally, push down or anything, but instead it has locking levers. Basically, to switch it, you have to pull on it to get it out of the detent and then push really hard down to actually put the switch to the cutoff position. Obviously a robust design that makes sense when you have a switch that really shouldn't be turned off, especially mid-flight, which is something that apparently happened here. Furthermore, in the cockpit voice recording, just after the engines had been turned off, one of the pilots is heard asking why he cut off the switch, to which the other pilot responded that he did not do so. Now this is not exactly a transcript given here, and we don't know which one of the pilots said what, but it's a clear indication that these switches were indeed set to cut off. Now, around 5 seconds after the cutoff action happens, the ram air turbine deployed, which is something that everyone's talked about. The ram air turbine is this spinning propeller that provides the airplane with necessary hydraulics to keep flying in case the engines are lost, and you can clearly see it in this picture being out. Now, because of the engine loss, the airplane obviously loses altitude just before crossing the airport perimeter wall. Now, 10 seconds after the fuel cutoff switches were set to cut off, they were switched back onto run, which is exactly the point where the APU inlet door began opening. Why? Because the 787 is designed to be able to immediately restart the engines when the fuel switch is set back to run. In aviation, this is called a relight, where the airplane automatically introduces a thrust recovery sequence to get those engines back running as quickly as possible. Yes, these engines were turning on, but obviously were not able to turn back on fast enough. Now, during this time, the pilots transmitted the Mayday, Mayday, Mayday call, where they apparently mentioned their lost thrust, with the airplane crashing into several buildings not far away from the runway just a few seconds later. Number 3, very concerning assumptions. Now, every airplane is designed so that switches that shouldn't be switched on accident won't be switched on accident. That is obviously true for the fuel control switches, as I've mentioned before. These are nearly impossible to accidentally delete, especially when your hands are right here. When the throttle is at max position and your hands are here, there's no way they could reach down and put the fuel control to the off position. Once again, on every flight, a significant part that an airplane has, this is the case. For example, on the fuel dumping buttons as well, you have to first remove the plastic covers to be able to press the switch, which is the concerning truth behind this crash. The question arises now, did one of the two flight crew turn off the engines intentionally in the pursuit of suicide? And that is a serious consideration. From what I can tell from the report, there was no one sitting in the jump seat that would have been able to access these switches. It was just the two pilots indeed. You know, this reminds me a lot about Egypt Air Flight 990 that happened in 1999. That was a Boeing 767 that during cruise had the first officer move the start levers for both engines from run to the cutoff position, shutting off the fuel flow to the engines. And it wouldn't at all be the first time a pilot's suicide would cost lives. And this may be a weird point to make, but there is probably no better option, especially nowadays, to commit this action than by doing what exactly happened here. Turn off the engines deliberately after rotation at an altitude where the airplane is unable to get out of it, at a altitude where an airplane is most vulnerable to such a thing. So yes, to sum it up, it's nearly impossible to accidentally turn off the switches, and it could very well be that one of the pilots intentionally did it, although we're definitely going to have to wait out for a proper investigation on that. But there is one thing. Number 4, could it have been a mechanical defect after all? Now, in 2018, the FAA put out a special airworthiness information bulletin that affects most Boeing models, including the model 787, 8, and 9. And it is about the very engine and fuel control that we've been talking about. Let's see what it reads here. The Boeing company received reports from operators of the 737 that the fuel control switches were installed with a locking feature disengaged. Yes, the very locking feature that I've been talking about. The fuel control switches or engine start switches are installed on the control stand in the flight deck and are used by the pilot to supply or cut off fuel to the engine. The fuel control switch has a locking feature to prevent inadvertent operation that could result in unintended switch movement between the fuel supply and fuel cutoff positions. In order to move the switch from one position to the other under the condition where the locking feature is engaged, it is necessary for the pilot to lift the switch up while transitioning the switch position. If the locking feature is disengaged, the switch can be moved between the two positions without lifting the switch during transition, and the switch would be exposed to the potential of inadvertent operation. Inadvertent operation of the switch could result in an unintended consequence such as in-flight engines shutdown. Now this was just a recommendations-based bulletin. Airlines that had these Honeywell switches in place, yes exactly these ones, were not required to do any maintenance on those switches. And this is not confirmed, but it would make sense that these Honeywell switches on the 787 by Air India were built far before 2018, because the plane was far older than 2018. But interestingly, the very 787 that we're talking about from Air India had its throttle replaced 2 times, in 2019 and 2023, although it was never checked for any defect on the locking mechanism. So yes, there still could be the chance that this was really an accident, although I find the likelihood of an inherent defect relatively low. But other than that, it is very unlikely that the pilots accidentally put the switches off. Once again, they're hard to actually move. And second of all, the fuel control buttons are deliberately placed far away from anything else so you could mix it up. I mean, last year we talked about the Swift Air 737 that crashed. Back then, the problem was that the anti-ice switches and the hydraulic switches are at a relatively similar place on the overhead panel, and they also have the same switch feel to them, and the pilots did end up switching the wrong switch and actually getting rid of the hydraulics, causing a crash. But I don't find it believable that this would have happened here. See, these fuel controls are only touched maybe under 3 conditions by pilots: on startup and on shutdown, and maybe on an emergency situation. For example, if you were to have something like this, an engine fire, and pilots want to put out the engine fire as quickly as possible in order for the fire not to catch onto the wings. But on the other hand, pilots are deliberately trained to not turn off the engines to distinguish the fire until they reach a safe altitude. Under a certain altitude, these switches should never be touched. It's something that you learn in airline pilot training. Number 5. Conclusion. I think everyone was very confused to hear the preliminary report, because what happened on this plane is just a really odd thing. So odd that pilot suicide sounds like the most feasible option. I really do hope now, with the world speculating on that the families involved of the crew don't have to take up the toll on that. But if this were to have happened, this very thing that we're speculating, then I'm pretty sure it would change a lot about how in aviation we deal with things like mental health, how we deal with the future, the idea of the single pilot cockpit for something. It's something that will stay on my mind for a very long time. So prayers out to the deceased, and if you do feel unwell, I hope you reach out to people close to you and seek help. That's all I have to say. So thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Good night.